استقبل رواد الفضاء السعودي
موعد الانطلاق
من تلقي رائدي
السعودية ريانا برناوي الكورني
ستسجل تاريخا
بمداد من ذهب
ورفع مستوى الاهتمام بالفضاء لدى الأجيال الناشئة.
Dragging, copy. Go for launch.
3, 2, 1. Engines full power.
السلام عليكم من الفضاء. والله شرف مرة كبير أن نكون نحن في هذه الرحلة التاريخية. زي ما تشوفونا نطفو يعني ونحاول نثبت نفسنا، لكن فعلا أحب أبدأ الشكر بقيادتنا وصاحب الرؤية ولي عهدنا محمد بن سلمان على دعمه لهذه المهمة. شكرا للهيئة السعودية للفضاء، شكرا أكسيوم، شكرا سبيسكس، شكرا ناسا، وكالات الفضاء اليابانية والأوروبية كلهم على تدريبهم لنا. طبعا شكرا لستي ولعائلتي الجميلة وأصحابي ورواد الفضاء السعوديين علي الغامدي ومريم فردوس على دعمهم في هذه الرحلة. لأبناء الوطن الغالي، نحن الآن في عصر التمكين والازدهار بفضل الله ثم قيادتنا. الحمد لله نحن الآن وصلنا عنان السماء، فكل اللي نحتاج نسويه إنه نحلم بإذن الله ونشتغل على أحلامنا وبإذن الله رح نوصل.
An awesome experience.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم لك الحمد الشكر، الحمد لله على الفرصة، الحمد لله على اللحظة التاريخية اللي نعيشها. مو بس أنا أعيشها، إحنا وأنتو سوية. استمتعنا صراحة بالإطلاق، وأنا متأكد أنكم أنتو استمتعتوا بالمشاهدة. شكرا لكل من دعمنا، شكرا كل من وقف معنا وساعدنا، شكرا لمن وصلنا لهذه المرحلة، شكرا لسمو سيدي خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك سلمان بن عبد العزيز، شكرا لولي عهده الأمير محمد بن سلمان على هذا الدعم والتمكين والثقة فينا كشباب طموحين برغبة بلهفة بأن نحقق المستحيل بإذن الله مع دعمكم وتوفيقكم. أهلي أنا في الفضاء، الحلم تحقق، اللهم لك الحمد الشكر. وقريبا إن شاء الله في المستقبل القريب الكثير سوف ينضم لنا إن شاء الله، ونراكم قريبا من محطة الفضاء الدولية.
استقبل رواد الفضاء السعودي
موعد الانطلاق
من تلقي رائدي
الفضاء السعودية
ريانا برناوي الكورني
ستسجل تاريخا
بمداد من ذهب
ورفع مستوى الاهتمام بالفضاء لدى الأجيال الناشئة.
Dragging, copy. Go for launch.
3, 2, 1. Engines full power.
السلام عليكم من الفضاء. والله شرف مرة كبير أن نكون نحن في هذه الرحلة التاريخية. زي ما تشوفونا نطفو يعني ونحاول نثبت نفسنا، لكن فعلا أحب أبدأ الشكر بقيادتنا وصاحب الرؤية ولي عهدنا محمد بن سلمان على دعمه لهذه المهمة. شكرا للهيئة السعودية للفضاء، شكرا أكسيوم، شكرا سبيس، شكرا ناسا، وكالات الفضاء اليابانية والأوروبية كلهم على تدريبهم لنا. طبعا شكرا لستي ولعائلتي الجميلة وأصحابي ورواد الفضاء السعوديين علي الغامدي ومريم فردوس على دعمهم في هذه الرحلة. لأبناء الوطن الغالي، نحن الآن في عصر التمكين والازدهار بفضل الله ثم قيادتنا. الحمد لله نحن الآن وصلنا عنان السماء، فكل اللي نحتاج نسويه إنه نحلم بإذن الله ونشتغل على أحلامنا وبإذن الله رح نوصل.
An awesome experience.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم لك الحمد الشكر، الحمد لله على الفرصة، الحمد لله على اللحظة التاريخية اللي نعيشها. مو بس أنا أعيشها، إحنا وأنتو سوية. استمتعنا صراحة بالإطلاق، وأنا متأكد أنكم أنتو استمتعتوا بالمشاهدة. شكرا لكل من دعمنا، شكرا كل من وقف معنا وساعدنا، شكرا لمن وصلنا لهذه المرحلة، شكرا لسمو سيدي خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك سلمان بن عبد العزيز، شكرا لولي عهده الأمير محمد بن سلمان على هذا الدعم والتمكين والثقة فينا كشباب طموحين برغبة بلهفة بأن نحقق المستحيل بإذن الله مع دعمكم وتوفيقكم. أهلي أنا في الفضاء، الحلم تحقق، اللهم لك الحمد الشكر. وقريبا إن شاء الله في المستقبل القريب الكثير سوف ينضم لنا إن شاء الله، ونراكم قريبا من محطة الفضاء الدولية.
استقبل ولي العهد رواد الفضاء السعودي
موعد الانطلاق
تلقي رائدي
السعوديين
Rayana Barnawi Al-Qarni.
ستسجل تاريخا
بمداد من ذهب
Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
ورفع مستوى الاهتمام بالفضاء لدى الأجيال الناشئة.
Dragging. Copy. Go for launch.
3, 2, 1. Engines full power.
السلام عليكم من الفضاء. والله شرف مرة كبير أن نكون نحن في هذه الرحلة التاريخية. زي ما تشوفونا نطفو يعني ونحاول نثبت نفسنا، لكن فعلا أحب أبدأ الشكر بقيادتنا وصاحب الرؤية ولي عهدنا محمد بن سلمان على دعمه لهذه المهمة. شكرا للهيئة السعودية للفضاء، شكرا أكسيوم، شكرا سبيس، شكرا ناسا، وكالات الفضاء اليابانية والأوروبية كلهم على تدريبهم لنا. طبعا شكرا لستي ولعائلتي الجميلة وأصحابي ورواد الفضاء السعوديين علي الغامدي ومريم فردوس على دعمهم في هذه الرحلة. لأبناء الوطن الغالي، نحن الآن في عصر التمكين والازدهار بفضل الله ثم قيادتنا. الحمد لله نحن الآن وصلنا عنان السماء، فكل اللي نحتاج نسويه إنه نحلم بإذن الله ونشتغل على أحلامنا وبإذن الله رح نوصل.
An awesome experience.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم لك الحمد الشكر، الحمد لله على الفرصة، الحمد لله على اللحظة التاريخية اللي نعيشها. مو بس أنا أعيشها، إحنا وأنتو سوية. استمتعنا صراحة بالإطلاق، وأنا متأكد أنكم أنتو استمتعتوا بالمشاهدة. شكرا لكل من دعمنا، شكرا كل من وقف معنا وساعدنا، شكرا لمن وصلنا لهذه المرحلة، شكرا لسمو سيدي خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك سلمان بن عبد العزيز، شكرا لولي عهده الأمير محمد بن سلمان على هذا الدعم والتمكين والثقة فينا كشباب طموحين برغبة بلهفة بأن نحقق المستحيل بإذن الله مع دعمكم وتوفيقكم. أهلي أنا في الفضاء، الحلم تحقق، اللهم لك الحمد الشكر. وقريبا إن شاء الله في المستقبل القريب الكثير سوف ينضم لنا إن شاء الله، ونراكم قريبا من محطة الفضاء الدولية.
استقبل رواد الفضاء السعودي
موعد الانطلاق
من تلقي رائدين
السعوديين
Rayana Barnawi Al-Qarni.
ستسجل تاريخا
بمداد من ذهب.
Kingdom of Saudi Arabia
ورفع
serving
مستوى
as
الاهتمام بالفضاء لدى الأجيال الناشئة.
Dragging, copy. Go for launch.
3, 2, 1. Engines full power.
السلام عليكم من الفضاء. والله شرف مرة كبير أن نكون نحن في هذه الرحلة التاريخية. زي ما تشوفونا نطفو يعني ونحاول نثبت نفسنا، لكن فعلا أحب أبدأ الشكر بقيادتنا وصاحب الرؤية ولي عهدنا محمد بن سلمان على دعمه لهذه المهمة. شكرا للهيئة السعودية للفضاء، شكرا أكسيوم، شكرا سبيس، شكرا ناسا، وكالات الفضاء اليابانية والأوروبية كلهم على تدريبهم لنا. طبعا شكرا لستي ولعائلتي الجميلة وأصحابي ورواد الفضاء السعوديين علي الغامدي ومريم فردوس على دعمهم في هذه الرحلة. لأبناء الوطن الغالي، نحن الآن في عصر التمكين والازدهار بفضل الله ثم قيادتنا، الحمد لله. نحن الآن وصلنا عنان السماء، فكل اللي نحتاج نسويه إنه نحلم بإذن الله ونشتغل على أحلامنا، وبإذن الله رح نوصل.
An awesome experience.
Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to space, and it should be black now because space is normally we do new things. So we also test now the management, if they can work without a clicker, if they can work without nodes, because in space you can plan and predict, but sometimes it's going differently. My name is Frank Salzgeber. I'm the acting Vice Governor for Space in CST. I was 19 years with the European Space Agency. I had my own startup company. I was with Apple, and now I'm super excited to be with my family here in the kingdom and with my colleagues helping to create the space ecosystem. And we have a lot of kids here. Where are the kids? Hello, kids. Afan is big kids. I see some astronauts. Very good. So I want to bring a little bit to a journey back because Steve Jobs, in his Stanford speech, April 2015, said that the dots of your career only make a connection when you look backwards. So I was going back to my time when I was 9 years old, and I want to have the first slide, please. My world when I was 9 years old was Lego, and they had walking robots, they had moon buggies, they had a starship, they have small rockets, and I do remember there was white, yellow, transparent one, and only one blue one. The blue one was the big boss, and that was my hero when I was 9, because I want to become an astronaut, which is the question now to everybody. Who wants to become astronaut? Yes, very good. So I see a lot of hands not raised. That's fine. And 77, that was the time when Lego was doing that. And a couple of years later, NASA was testing a big ship, a spaceship called Space Shuttle. And I really thought when I was 9 years old that that's the future. We have walking robots, we're going to Mars. Instead of that, what we got was Facebook and Twitter. Anyhow, that was space in the 80s. Wookiees, but things were differently. We didn't really travel. But anyhow, next slide, please. I told you already my name, and we're building in the kingdom together with the Saudi Space Commission, which will become in the future the Space Agency, the ecosystem for space. And there's nothing cooler than space. But to understand space, we have to look a little bit back. So, next slide, please. That's our Milky Way. 100 million light years in diameter. And what you see there are not stars, these are other galaxies. About 200 billion stars you have there. And this is us, this is the Earth. So for everybody who has raised their hand or not raised their hand, I have a news for you. We're all astronauts. We're all astronauts on the spaceship Earth, rotating around the sun with 70,000 kilometers per hour and 100,000 kilometers around the center of the universe. And now we can discuss everybody's astronauts, so we have to really look after our spaceship, our planet Earth. Anyhow, I want to, next slide please. I want to speak a little bit about space and what space means. One of my jobs was 20 years ago, head of commercial development of human space flight and exploration. So I had the pleasure to work with a big group of astronauts. And I want to bring a little bit the journey to see what our astronauts going at the moment. And the 80s, there was the big shuttle. It was a huge machine. You had these two boosters. It was going from Cape Canaveral, the same platform, by the way, or next to the same platform where our astronauts was going. So the shuttle was a very complex machine. And the complex machine had impacts. The impact was we had two big catastrophes with the shuttle starts. When you were becoming an astronaut, like His Royal Highness Prince Sulman was, or is, the survival rate of an astronaut using the shuttle was 1 to 36. Then when I look into the audience, I see the front row. Gentlemen, you will not make it today. So I think that's pretty tough, 1 to 36. So it was really dangerous to use the shuttle. Everybody who was becoming astronaut had to be well-trained to learn. They don't do that for the money. They don't really that for the country because they really want to do that. Next slide, please. Shuttle is approaching the space station, and I will speak a little bit about space station. It was a very comfortable ride. It was not the safest ride, but it could take a lot of cargo, and we see later in the space station the cargo bay, and you see it outside there. That's the size of the diameter of the cargo bay. Next slide, please. But going to space station is not like tourism. These are the numbers what we see of people who was taking already a plane for vacation. A lot of people said. How many people you think went to space? 622. Okay, correct? 624. The line, and this is the next slide, please, is really flat. So we have not increased. But trust me, in the next couple of years, this will change. More people will go to space. Space becomes cheaper, new rockets, and there will be an area where we will colonize Moon, Mars, and beyond. So our crew is part of these numbers. It's not updated yet, but it will be. Next slide, please. There are 3 rockets where you can use at the moment to go to space. And I start with the most reliable one because it was flown over 100,000 times, 1,000 times. The Soyuz rocket. The Soyuz rocket burns kerosene. It starts in Baikonur in Kazakhstan, which was part of the Soviet Union, and it has not really changed since the Soviet times. They adapted it. It's a very reliable rocket, and it's called Soyuz when it's manned, and Progress when you have a cargo, and the Soyuz rocket going to space station. And America still use that because they have a special deal. An American astronaut goes with the Soyuz, a Russian astronaut goes with Dragon at the moment. Next click, please. The good thing is when you're there in Baikonur, you can go very close to the rocket. It's a very special place. Next slide, please. And another rocket, which is Long March. That's the Chinese rockets. That was Long March 2F. The 2F version is the only one which can carry 3 people. It has a little bit similarity with what the Russians are doing and were doing. So there were certain technologies copied and applied. And this is the mission, I think, from 1 year ago, 2022, going to their space station, because also China has started to build a smaller space station. Next slide, please. This we have seen. Who has seen the launch? Who has seen the launch? Oh, I see not all hands by. You go to YouTube, watch the launch. And this is something, it's one of the cool things to do. So the Falcon 9 is not super big. But it's a pretty new rocket. And it's the only 3 rockets in the world what really you can go to really orbit when it comes to astronauts. Maybe you remember the Apollo program. We have a mock-up out there. The Saturn rocket was much more bigger. The Saturn rocket, that you get a little bit of idea, burned 70 tons of fuel a second. 70 tons of fuel a second. The Falcon 9 use also kerosene, LOX, which is liquid oxygen, starts very reliable, is a reusable rocket. And here what you see, this is approaching, is the Soyuz capsule, which is a capsule, you will see it later, approaching the space station. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks inside the Russian capsule. You know, that's Scott Skelly, American astronaut. It's really tiny. You see a lot of switches, old technology, reliable Russian technology, but it's not very modern. And next slide, please. This is when you approach a space station. And this is a Dragonfly, which is same capsule our astronauts used with a different docking mechanism. Next slide, please. And then slowly they approach the space station. Next slide, please. And yesterday there was the docking. The docking here is a Russian docking. Our docking was looking different. And inside, you see, it's looking more like a Tesla, does it? Yeah, you have nice monitors, you have chairs. That's the 5-seaters version. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, it's more, 7. And inside, it's all a little bit more modern. It's a little bit steered by the ground control. It's approaching. It starts to be reliable. Next slide, please. And next stop is, for our astronauts, the ISS. Next slide, please. The ISS, the International Space Station, and I was part of the team from the European side helping to build it. It's about 2 football fields big, 1 football field big, and the pressurized volume of 2 jumbo jets. So 100 by 100 meters, 30 meters. And what you see there, and this is the older version of the space station, we come to a new version, you see the solar panels, which brings the power. Next to the solar panels are the thrust. In the thrust you have, and keep that for a second, You have the thrust. You see these white ones? These white ones are radiators because inside the space station you produce heat and you have to get rid of the heat. The space station is not far away. It's just 400 kilometers above us and is rotating every 92 minutes around Earth. Every 90 minutes around Earth. In a daytime, the space station, with a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour, is doing the same distance between Earth and Moon every day. So we don't have a frequent flyer program for our astronauts because we could not afford that. Of course, that's difficult because you don't have a rhythm. So all the astronauts have a special rhythm. And in 400 kilometers around Earth, you're still in the magnetic field and you're pretty safe. Nevertheless, the astronauts are always saying, it's really difficult because you have a certain time resonance or not. Keep that slide for a second. That was my part. There's the Columbus model. This is one of the dockings. American model, Kibo model from the Japanese. There you see a Soyuz docked. So it's pretty complex. Anyhow, it's the biggest machinery infrastructure built by mankind in space and rotating around Earth since several years. Next slide, please. So here, this is, who is the engineer? Now for the kids, who wants to become an engineer? Yes, very good. Yeah, not everybody can fly. We need also good engineers, and we need more engineers in the kingdom. So a little bit of drawing. The space station is a project where several nations work together. And I was in the military still in the Cold War. And for me, that Russians, Americans, Europeans, Japanese work peaceful together, that was really a mind-blowing moment. And here also they work together and they sit together. Nevertheless, you also have a part, I think it's Node 1 with the American and the Russian segment. That's Checkpoint Charlie, because every nation is responsible for its own model. And what you have to understand, you will see it in the TV. Here we have a floor, we have a ceiling. On space station, you have only walls, because it depends how you come into the room. It's always looking different. So our astronauts the first day will be really confused, because that's a new part of the space station, and it's not. But they're just rotated by 90 degrees or 180 degrees. So in the beginning, that's a little problematic. All right, next slide, please. It's all about food. Tim Kopra, Roman Romanenko, we have Frank De Winne here, he's a colleague from me, he's the head of the astronaut center in Cologne, where our colleagues have copied. And trust me, they like fresh food, because you are half year, some people on space station, and every 10 days, you have the same diet. Every 10 days, you have the same food. And then you have Russian food and American food. And then, of course, the astronaut saying, my dear friend, can we exchange? Next slide, please. Going outside of space station is pretty tough, because you have a suit, you have about 0.6 atmosphere, you're hammered into the suit, you're looking like a Michelin man, and you go outside of a space station, below you the Earth, and you have your own system. And we had already 2 incidents which were very critical. One was with Chris Hartfeld, but the other was with Luca Permitano, which a small valve in the suit was leaking. And when you look about experiments in microgravity, the water is not going down. It's sticking to the surface. So the water was sticking, coming over the head, closing the first ear, starting come over the first eye. And the problem is, I said, okay, when it's my nose and my mouth, it's bad. It's really bad if you're outside of a space station, 28,000 kilometers, rotating around the Earth, and you cannot breathe anymore because water is blocking your mouth and your nose. And he even thought about, maybe I have to open my hatch, which is not so nice in microgravity and in vacuum. But the astronauts are trained as a team, like our crew. And he had his colleagues from Canada and said, you have to help me. I trust you my life. And he brought his hand, and together they managed to go inside before the water was covering his mouth. So this is something. They are really brave. They really are trained to also in the most difficult situations. And they work as a team, and I think that is a very good role model which we have to have. Okay, next click. That is, do we have Star Trek fans here? Some Star Trek fans here? So that's not ESA official uniforms yet. So this is Samantha Cristoforetti on the Futura mission a couple of years ago, and she was on space station on the crew before. And there's a reason why also she's from Italy. There's a reason why the space station has an espresso machine, by the way. True story. And what she's showing on the back in the cupola is a cargo vehicle also from SpaceX. And that's the change. You have private companies going to space station, providing food, power, astronaut transportation. So private companies are taking over the space and changing the world. Next slide, please. So that's inside. This is Alexander Gerst. This is a Russian model. It's a Vesna model. And you see, it does not look really like a lab. And that's really a problem. You have to stick everything on the wall, because if it's flying around, it's gone. Yeah, you'll find it in the ventilation system later. But everything has a place. So everything has to be sticked. And you will also see that in the beginning, the first 3-4 days, the astronauts have a problem. A problem because the heart does not recognize that you're not on Earth anymore. So the heads of our astronauts will look bigger than normal, because the heart is pumping too much blood into the head and not enough into the feet. So after several days, normally this goes away. Next slide, please. So this is the food. There are blue boxes and red boxes. In the past, Europe has provided the water. There was Russian water, American water, because they were different treated. The good thing is with the astronauts, they're sitting then at the table you have seen, and then they will say, Vladimir, what food you have? And John says, I have this burger. Can we share? So by the end of the day, it's all about humans, and it's all about having a dinner together. And I think yesterday at the docking, we'll see, very nice. There were some dates were handed over to our astronauts. Next slide, please. Okay, that's Mark and Scott Kelly. Scott Kelly is pretty cool. He was a year and longer on space station. They're twins. Yeah? And Scott always said, okay, my brother is also astronaut, but he's not a real astronaut because he was only 50 days in space. You know, I was over a year. And over a year in space station, trust me, it's tough, you know. So because 1 year, no shower. There's no shower on space station. Can you imagine? So you have wet towels and you clean it. 1 year, every time the same food. In that time, it was one bathroom, one toilet. Now they have two. And they recycle all liquids. That means 1 year, you drink your own pee. Okay, I have to correct. You not only drink your own pee, because everything is recycled, you also drink the pee of your colleagues. Everything will be recycled. So, and this is also what Scott said when he opened the hatch and the smell of space station was coming in. He said, that was a stupid idea. Anyhow, they do it because they really believe it. Why was this experiment so important? Because they're identical twins. And they looked at really what was the change in genetic, how radiation had the influence. And it was not so much how the body can repair itself and heal itself. And also if in size they have changed. So, Scott and Mark. And when you have time, this is what all the astronauts doing. They're watching to Earth because there's no better view. When you can look down, there's this Tracy from the American astronauts called looking down in the cupola. Next slide, please. That's the view what you get. And at the end of my presentation, I share you a movie from Andrei Kuiper's Outside Space Station. That's the River of Nile, Sinai. We see already part of the Saudi shore. Every 90 minutes, you have this view coming from the morning, in the evening, during the daylight. And I think everybody where I spoke, and it was a pleasure to work with them, they're coming with a different view and see that the little bit, what you see, you hardly see it. On 100 kilometers, the atmosphere, which makes life on Earth or not. How vulnerable the Earth is. This blue marble and the darkness of space. All right. They go back. This is the Soyuz. So it's not first class. Huh? It's not first class, not even eco class. It's really, really packed. They go back to the capsule, in the Soyuz capsule, and the Dragon is a little bit better. Next slide, please, Alexander Gerst. They pre-dock, they go down, they decrease speed. Next slide, please. And then this is the Soyuz landing with a big parachute. Next slide, please. And this is the size of the Soyuz. 3 people are jammed in that, and they hammered in the Kazan desert. Next slide, please. And this is what our astronauts will do in some days. They will go also with a parachute, but they land in the sea, and which is pretty safe, and then somebody will pick them up from a ship, and then they will return to Earth. And it's the same principle the Apollo program has used in the past. It's reliable and it's safe, because nothing is more important than the life of our crew and our astronauts. Next slide, please. And this is how they said, and there's a nice communication for the first bigger crew, a colleague from JAXA, NASA, and they ask you, welcome, thank you much, welcome back to Earth, and thank you for flying SpaceX. And then the commander said, okay, he said, how many miles we subscribed? They said, I think it's 1,300 miles. However, you have to subscribe to the SpaceX mileage program. Okay, it was a joke, but there's also astronaut humor. Next slide, please. Nothing will work in space. And I think that's the message to everybody. It's like in the military, like in other thing. Nothing will work without the people on the ground, without the crew. And that's amazing to see that the astronauts really give their life and trust their life to the crew on the ground, doing the planning, doing the work, helping to prepare the mission, before the mission, after the mission. And this is really needed. Not everybody can fly, but you can be part of the team to make the people fly and change the world and maybe hammer a dent into the universe. So this is why we're here in the Saudi Space Commission, but also in CST, helping to go the next step further. Next slide, please. Why we do human spaceflight and why we do space exploration, and this picture I got from our NASA colleagues. You see on the launch pad the Columbus shuttle, ready for launch, ready to leave the haven. And at the front you see 3 ships. And these are the rebuilds. And in the front is the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria was the flagship of Christopher Columbus. And this is the rebuild. A society stops exploring, stops progressing. There was a Russian scientist who said, Earth is the cradle of mankind, but nobody wants to be in the cradle forever. Our kids are growing. They will change the world. When we are kids, we explore every day new things. When we become older, we exploit what we have in our brains. But it's the curiosity who drives us to change the things. And this is the most important things about exploration, is the curiosity. What is behind this hill? What is below the sea level? What is behind Mother Earth? Next slide, please. But it's a mindset. And this was April 2014, where a 33-year-old rocket tried to land on the autonomous Storm ship, 90 by 60 meters. And it's about, I think, 6 by 6 meters where this rocket should land. That was SpaceX. And it's the mindset when we speak about innovation and changing certain things. And the rocket was exploding. And I want to share with you what the international press made out of this event. Because it's the mindset, if you want to change something, which makes an impact or not. Let's see the American press, what they said. Another click, and we got the American press. So SpaceX, you see April 2016, April released rocket camera, almost landed. Yeah? So 15, April 15. So wait, go back. So I was too quick. So that is, what is in the school model? You have an F or an A. A is the best one in Saudi Arabia, or 1? A. So that's not an A. What is it? A C. C plus. Yeah? So let me see what the German press, I'm half German, so what the German press, next slide here. German press said, SpaceX failed again. That's an F. Yeah, that's bad. But you have to see, you fly this rocket to space. You turn it. Nobody else did it before. And then you land, and then you maybe fall. That's not so bad. That's not so bad. Let's see what Alan made out of his assembly. Let's see. Next slide. Full rapid disassembly event. Ship is fine. Exciting day. That's the B minus. It's the attitude which counts. And 1 year later, 2000 April in the same, I think, months, 2000 April 2016, he managed to land a rocket. And I think this is standard now. And I showed you something which a lot of people have not watched. Next slide, please. There's a small movie. There was this Tesla. We have a little bit sound. So there was a Falcon Heavy. Falcon Heavy has 3 boosters. Yeah, they're coming back to the Earth. This is still animated. They're changing positions, similar to what we yesterday saying. Most of the people switched away. And then, of course, it's also celebrating when something new is coming. There, one thruster of the 9 Merlin engine is ignited. And they really go from high speed down to Cape Canaveral. And we saw that yesterday. And both rockets land at the same spot. And they really celebrate it. Alan must be somewhere now. That's not science fiction. That's normal. SpaceX is launching a rocket every 5 days. Last year, 63% of all payloads sent to space was one company, SpaceX. The rest was the rest of the world, including America and China and whoever. One company, because they believed in it, because the team was working together. Anyhow, let me see what we have. And this is the next thing. It was not working very well, but Starship is huge. Starship is huge. There are 36 Raptor engine, and maybe I show you on the next slide that you see a little bit. So these are people, huh? So this is the top part of it. So Starship will change the world because it will lift 100 tons into orbit, and it will refuel in orbit. It will go to Moon and Mars, and NASA will use it to land on the Moon. Anyhow, I'm a big fan of Starship. The future will be private space stations. Axiom, Lockheed, name them all. The space companies will, or the private company will build the future of space. Next slide, please. And maybe we will have a village on the Moon. And it goes back to my childhood because there was a movie series, next slide please, was called Lunar Base Alpha 1. Sometimes you have to be patient until your dreams and your future thoughts are coming through. And next slide, we will occupy Mars. We will maybe transform it or not, but mankind is curious and they are eager to learn and eager to change. And the new real estate will be maybe not then be building the new part of Riyadh, but building maybe a greenhouse on Mars. And the interesting part will be how you finance it. Can we put that on the Saudi Stock Exchange? This was a picture my mom kept when I was 9 years old. So it maybe was not making sense in that time that I'm moving space, but today I'm in space. And the only slide which you have to understand, and this is my son Johannes. I have 2 boys which are studying here now in the kingdom and go to school. And that was Johannes when he was 1 year old. He had this toolbox of our apartments, holiday apartment, and he was dismantling this toolbox and seeing a screw, what is this? And it's the only slide, especially for the parents and for us older ones, and for you as kids. Nobody should destroy your curiosity, because this drives innovation. This drives to do new things. School sometimes to kill it, and university tries to teach us back. Don't lose your curiosity. And for the older ones, find it back. Because these are the people changing the world. And I close with a picture from Mars Express 2003 on the way to Mars. It's a European spacecraft. And Mars Express on the way to Mars was moving back and made a photo. On the left, you see Earth. On the right, you see a little bit, which is the Moon. So we know only the picture of the Moon in the night sky, or we know the pictures when we see from the Apollo programs the Earth. But sometimes, next slide please, you have to change your position, because that's really the space you need to get off the ground. Another click, thank you very much. And if you want to stay with me for another 3 minutes, I'll show you the movie. And now we make really dark. And we want to see the movie. Click me away. Really dark, can we do it really dark? And play the movie. Yes, please. That was from Andrei Kuipers. And sound. That's from the space station in the night.
We're floating in the moonlit sky. The people far below are sleeping as we fly. I'm holding very tight. I'm riding in the midnight blue. frozen sky. We're drifting over icy mountains floating by. Suddenly swooping low on an ocean deep, rousing up a mighty monster from his sleep. We're walking in the air, we're dancing in the midnight sky. And everyone who sees us greets us as we fly.
Okay, thank you so very much. Stay, if you have colleagues, kids, friends, apply for scholarships in space. Which visit the SSC website, the CST website. A lot of things will come up. Thank you so much. And tell everybody you know to visit our booth, to our exhibition center, and see you on this channel.
Ladies and gentlemen, coming up on the stage, Mr. Irfan Chaudhry, the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at the Saudi Space Commission. Please stay tuned. سيدات والسادة، رحبوا معنا على المسرح الأستاذ عرفان شاندري، نائب الرئيس للاستراتيجية والشراكات في الهيئة السعودية للفضاء. شكراً.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Irfan Chowdhury. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at the Saudi Space Commission, and I'm delighted to be here. I note that this recording is also taking place live with colleagues at Tehran and in Jeddah as well, so a warm welcome to everyone. Over the course of the next 20-30 minutes, I'm going to give you my own personal experiences, my overview, my space journey, and hopefully some of that resonates with you as well, and you get an understanding and appreciation of why I joined the Saudi Space Commission, and I'm so interested and intrigued. You would have heard earlier from Frank Salzgerber about the exciting space journey he took as well. I'm going to talk about my practical experiences and hopefully lessons learned from my own process as well. Okay, so my space journey started back in 2018. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm British. I was born in the UK. My parents were originally from Pakistan. They settled in the UK in the 1950s and 60s. My first experience in the civil service in the UK government was working for the UK Space Agency. In 2018, I joined as their head of international policy. If I tell you that if I ask you about the space agencies around the world, you know about NASA, you know about JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, you know about the Saudi Space Commission. There are over 100 countries in the world that have a space agency, and I'll explore some of those countries with you in a bit more detail. But my role in the UK Space Agency was to build and develop those strategic relationships with key international partners from all over the world. That's included the US, France, Germany, Italy, South Africa, colleagues in the Middle East, particularly the UAE Space Agency and the Saudi Space Commission. Those were crucial from our perspective. I then had the honor to be the international director at the Space Agency, and that involved working closely with the European Space Agency. So I was the head of the key delegations that represented the UK space sector at those fora. And then I moved across to the main department, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, where I was responsible not just for the strategy of the space sector, but also the regulation, the security, the environment, and the context under which you operate. For me, this was crucial because it's like driving a car. If there are no rules of the road for driving the car, as there isn't operating in space, it becomes open season. So it's important from our perspective that we ensure that there are rules and regulations and safety about operating in space. So that was an important role that I had within the Saudi Space Commission preparations with BAYS. Now, the second part of that was my role in joining the Saudi Space Commission. I joined in 2022 at the end of last year as the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships. The key element of that was I'm now charged working with His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, the CEO, His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, the CEO, but also with Minister Al-Swaha and other colleagues from across the agency in delivering the national space strategy. And you'll hear me talk about that in more detail later. But also, it's about delivering Saudi's Vision 2030. And seeing our astronauts in the International Space Station is one part of our massive space ambition for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So my role has been over 30 years in the making. I've worked in the defense sector, I've worked in security, I've worked in cyber, and now in space. So part of that journey, I'm an accountant by profession. So I'm not an engineer, but I have skill sets that can be useful within the space sector and the space community. And that's been really important. But my background has included procurement, operations, business development, and then crucially developing policy and strategy. So I work with a number of colleagues across from the Saudi Space Commission, representatives from the other government departments, particularly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the CST and MCIT departments. But you'll see that picture, those pictures at the bottom. I've worked in the UK Ministry of Defence, the Saudi Arabian National Guard. In 2001, 2003, as a member of the UK Ministry of Defence, I worked in cooperation with the Saudi National Guard based here in Riyadh. And again, the Space Agency, international trade, but also with colleagues at the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. So that military experience and that background I had was absolutely crucial in my career trajectory, moving from defense to security to space and cyber. I think it's also worth highlighting the international role that we play as the Saudi Space Commission in developing that space strategy. There are some great pictures here that I wanted to highlight for you, if I may. On the left-hand side, you've got His Excellency, the Chair of the Saudi Space Commission, Minister Al-Swaha, and the CEO, Dr. Al-Tamimi, His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, meeting with Michael Safradini, who is the President and CEO of Axiom. Axiom is the company that we worked with to get our 2 astronauts to the International Space Station. It's a private company. It's not a government organization, but it works closely with NASA and other space institutions and organizations. So that was an important meeting back in the USA in 2022, the summer of last year, which was finalizing our program for 2 Saudi astronauts to visit the International Space Station. And on the top right there, you will see the picture of His Excellency, alongside Minister Sarah Al-Amiri from the UAE Space Agency at the International Astronautical Congress, a key event in the space calendar. That was in Paris 2022, in September, October last year, where it's really about the whole space community coming together. And it includes those 100 countries that we talked about and the 100 representatives of space agencies from around the world. But it brings together industry, academia, space agencies, government, military, and students across the whole generation. And then that last picture at the bottom there is the visit of His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, the CEO of the Saudi Space Commission, to India earlier this year. So I was fortunate enough to join His Excellency for that visit, where we met with colleagues from the Indian Space Research Organization, the SSC equivalent in India, and seeing the technology and the capability that they've built and developed. And that's part of one of their satellites that they're developing at the moment, visiting their space center and seeing their launch capabilities. So the ambition for the Saudi Space Commission and for the Kingdom is to develop launch capabilities, look at satellite builds, satellite manufacture, bring the next generation of scientists, technical engineers, mathematicians all into the space community. So again, striking those partnerships with those emerging, developing space nations, India, the UK, USA, Japan, all of those countries are important and very crucial in building and developing that relationship that the Saudis see as building and developing our own ecosystem. I think the other thing worth noting in my role, I have 3 or 4 key areas of responsibility. One is building and developing those international strategic relationships. And we talked a little bit about the countries and the priorities where we see, particularly from a space perspective, but also looking at that from an international trajectory, where there's the wider geopolitics, which are the countries we need to strategically partner with. Then you've got building and developing international agreements. We talked about having the standards and the norms for operating and acting in space. We need to make sure that we're aligned with those international organizations and those international treaties. So that's an important aspect of our role. But then you also have the international organizations and committees. One in particular, the events that are taking place next week with the United Nations, the Office for Outer Space Affairs. So this is about our cooperation with international partners, demonstrating that the Saudi Space Commission, the Saudi space enterprise, has a legitimate voice to play on the international stage. So for us, it's membership, identification of those committees, working with the UN and bilaterally with partners to develop that cooperation. But then all of that is about building and developing the ecosystem within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You heard from my colleague Frank earlier about how do we encourage that next generation to want to go into the space sector. We need the engineers, we need the scientists, we need the rocket scientists, we need the pilots. And you look at the professions of our 2 astronauts, the biochemist, scientist, and an F-15 pilot. We have that range of skill sets that's absolutely crucial. So how do we build and develop that? And that is by developing the space ecosystem within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we do that at this early stage by bringing in key strategic partners. We talked about the earlier visits to the US with Axiom, We talked about the visit to the International Astronautical Congress in Paris with all the spacefaring nations. But then we also have countries like India, where we need to think about how they have developed their own space sector. We want to learn the lessons that they have identified, but also make them unique to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and to our workforce as well. Let's talk a little bit about the International Space Station. The International Space Station, our 2 astronauts will be there for about 8 or 9 days. So effectively, that is the home for our astronauts. For all those astronauts that visited the International Space Station, it is a place to live, but also it's an opportunity to provide scientific experiments. We are conducting, I think, 13 experiments for our 2 astronauts whilst they're up in space. Those results for those experiments that are conducted in space will be shared with the schools, the academic institutions within the kingdom. And we want to be able to share that experience and that understanding. It's also worth noting that the International Space Station is 250 meters above our head, 250 miles, above the Earth's surface. And it's orbiting the Earth. And you saw some of those fantastic pictures that Frank showed about the visual effects of seeing the Earth from that distance. The space station itself has over 5 key partners that were involved in building, designing, manufacturing, and transporting and setting up that International Space Station. And I mentioned a couple of them, and I'll focus on 2 in particular, but we've got NASA, United States, Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the European Space Agency, of which when I was in the UK, was a part and member of, and then the Canadian Space Agency, CSA. I'll say a little bit more about that, but it's worth noting that the International Space Station, when it was developed and conceived back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you remember what the relationship was like between the Russians and the Americans, but they were able to partner on the ISS. And even now, with everything that's happening in Ukraine and across the world, you're seeing partners between NASA and Roscosmos astronauts up at the International Space Station. And in fact, many of the American astronauts that were transported up to the International Space Station were transported on Russian aircraft, Russian rockets to get them up there. So that cooperation you see in space, you don't necessarily see that on Earth. So it's worth noting that there are no boundaries in space. There is that idea of cooperation and collaboration, and we see that across all of that work that we're doing within the International Space Station. The ownership and the use of that space station is governed by international treaties and agreements, but the practical aspects of astronauts helping support each other in space is fundamental, and it's crucial. The picture on the right gives you an indication of all the countries that have actually visited the International Space Station over the course of its creation and establishment. And you see spread all over the world. And you see the country, particularly with Russia, the US, Canada, and Brazil, but others as well. And the flags. The picture on the left is a picture that was taken yesterday. The 11 astronauts on the International Space Station that are living together for a period of time. Within that, you can see at the back there are 2 Saudi astronauts, but you'll also see in the light blue on the left-hand side there, the UAE, the Emirati astronaut, who's there on a long-duration program. But that combination is Russian, American, Saudi Arabian, UAE, Emirati, and I think there's a Japanese representative there as well. So 5 nations represented on the International Space Station as we speak. 11 astronauts living in that close environment. So this is the picture that was taken back in, 1998, of all the countries, the organizations, and the institutions that were involved in building and developing and designing the International Space Station. Roscosmos, NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, European Space Agency, JAXA, and elements of other organizations, including the private sector, so companies involved in that collaboration. And within that, you'll see certain elements are the solar panels, but you've also got introductions by work undertaken by the Japanese in terms of their modular system, which is here. And then above that, you can just see it, but the Canadian arm, which is the leverage systems that they use to operate. So the Canadian Space Agency was involved in developing that commercial technology. But it works not just with the space agencies, but with industry. So it's in partnership between the agencies, so government organizations, but also with the private sector. And that's been crucial in developing that long stay program for our astronauts. And you can see the complexity, the design and the structure. We're expecting the International Space Station will effectively come out of service in the next 15 or 20 years. At that point, when the International Space Station closes down, there are plans for a separate Chinese and separate US space station. So there will be none of that collaboration. But we want to see more of that engagement and partnership between the likes of JAXA, Roscosmos, European Space Agencies and others, building that collaboration. Whether that continues into the future, who knows, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is the summary slide of all the visitors, the astronauts that have visited the International Space Station since its creation. Overall, there have been over 397 flights, made up of 245 astronauts. Of that 245, 35 are women, including our one Saudi who is there at the moment. 9 have been tourists who have paid for the privilege to travel up on their own expense. Of that, a number of those astronauts, as you can imagine, have traveled on more than one occasion. In fact, I think there are 2 astronauts that have been to the International Space Station 5 times. Many of them have been one time, but you can see the big numbers there at the top, the US and Russia, in terms of the number of flights and in terms of the number of individuals involved as well. And you'll see a mixture for the US in terms of women, tourists, those that have paid for the privilege to travel, and then the number have done it 2, 3, 4, and 5 times. You then have many of those, if you take off United States, Russia, and Japan, you will see many of them are down to kind of single figures, where we're looking at particularly, some countries, I talked about those 100 countries that are involved in space agencies. Who knew that Kazakhstan or Malaysia had a space agency or a space organization, and in fact sent an astronaut up to the International Space Station? There are countries there you wouldn't imagine or would have the expense or the capability to do that, but they are there. Many of them work in close collaboration and partnership with each other. So when we talked about the UN, we talked about norms of behavior, we talked about standards. You can imagine if we didn't have rules for driving or speed cameras or whatever else it is, the open space would be difficult to manage and curtail. So you've got the list there, and we've been added on our colleagues from Saudi Arabia who are there at the moment, the 2 astronauts there. But it's important to recognize 245 individuals have visited that space station, the combination of men, women, but then also those that have made multiple visits. But it's also crucial that how many of them have made one flight, one visit, and that's it. That's important, but it's not the end of the story. We need to continue that experiment, that scientific engagement, that scientific enthusiasm, that interest. The next part is one of the things that I've been closely involved in, both in the UK, when I was at the UK Space Agency, and now more recently at the Saudi Space Commission. It's the Artemis program. I grew up, and I'm of an age when I could just about remember the Apollo program, to get the first man to walk on the lunar surface, and the Apollo programs that NASA instigated. Now, we have the Artemis program, which is led by NASA in the US. Artemis, in Greek mythology, is the twin sister of Apollo, and I'll come back to why that's important. But it's their NASA program for lunar exploration and also providing engagement and the opportunity to go further than the lunar surface, and I'll explain why. So the program itself, the Artemis program, was started in 2017. There is a plan for the first trip for the Americans to have humans back on the lunar surface. And the plan is by 2026, current plan, 2026, we'll see the first woman and the next man to land their feet on the lunar surface. But that's the start of the journey, and I'll come again into that program. So as a result of that, the Americans decided, even the Americans determined that they couldn't fund or have the necessary skills in the program to do this alone. So they wanted to bring in partners, including the UK and many of our European colleagues when I was at the UK Space Agency. But more recently, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, through the Saudi Space Commission, was a signatory to the Artemis Accords, and I'll explain more about that. But the intent is, by 2026, to have the first woman and the next man to walk on the lunar surface. But it's not just about the lunar surface. It's also about building habitat, accommodation, infrastructure on the lunar surface, intending to use the lunar surface to then go on to Mars. And Mars is the key goal that we have identified in that context. And the ability to do that is not based on keep transporting equipment capability from Earth to the lunar surface, but it's build, develop, structure, grow capability either on the lunar surface or on the internet or the new space station that will orbit the lunar surface, the lunar module. So the intent is, by 2026, we'll have the next woman and the next man to walk on the lunar surface, but the ambition is to then move on to Mars. So the agreement itself, the Artemis Accords, bilateral, set up originally on a bilateral basis, but now in partnership. There are now over 31 countries that have signed the Artemis Accords, including our colleagues at in the Saudi Space Commission, based on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. So I can say before I was born, but it's important to note that the Outer Space Treaty, international treaty that includes the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese, everyone, that governs the way that we operate in space. But that was a rule and treaty that was established in 1967. The question is that still valid today, given the development in technology and in capability? So as a result, the Artemis Accords are seen as a way of updating the Outer Space Treaty and operationalizing the Outer Space Treaty. That said, there is now politics, so there's a question about whether the Russian and the Chinese, through their own programs, would want to be a member and a partner or not. So this is something that we need to think about. And again, this goes back to the wider politics and the geopolitics of space in itself. They're intended to be a set of guidelines, behaviors and practices that the signatories sign up to and agree that they will operate under those circumstances. So this is a great picture that was taken, I think, 14th of July, 2022. So you may recognize some of the faces, you may not. The person in the top right-hand corner is Bill Nelson, who is the NASA administrator. So the senior individual in the NASA organization. The top left is Joanne Woods, who is the, I think, the senior delegate, senior American representative in the Kingdom, Riyadh. And then you've got on the bottom right there, you've got Her Royal Highness Princess Rima, who is our ambassador in Washington. And then on the bottom left, you have Minister Al-Swaha and His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, the CEO of the Saudi Space Commission, signing the Artemis Accords. And again, an important step and a milestone in the relationship that SSC, the Saudi Space Commission, is trying to build and develop about identifying key strategic partners and capturing the real opportunity that space affords to the kingdom, but also to its population as well. I should say a little bit about myself and why I was attracted to come to join the Saudi Space Commission. So I first met His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi at the IAC, the International Astronautical Congress, that took place a few years ago in Dubai, straight after the COVID lockdown was over. And I was intrigued to hear about their intent, their ambition, their drive, particularly in the context of building and developing their own national space strategy. So I met several of the colleagues from the Saudi Space Commission, heard about their ambition, their drive, met His Excellency Dr. Al-Tamimi, and was keen to hear more. And in fact, at that stage, the UK had just published our own national space strategy. And so we wanted to share our experiences, in fact, the mistakes that we made in building and developing that strategy, and how we could share our experiences with the Kingdom and particularly the Saudi Space Commission. So it was fortunate enough for me that literally a few months later, I was made the approach, and I was genuinely excited about the opportunity to come and work for the Saudi Space Commission, build on the ambition, the scale, the intent, not just of Saudi Vision 2030, but the intent, the drive that was outlined in the National Space Strategy and the ambition and the scope. And having the 2 astronauts is just one, dare I say it, small part of that level of ambition that we have for the Kingdom and for the Saudi space sector. It's about building the economic aspects of it. It's about identifying the skill sets, providing opportunities for the next generation in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. As I said, I'm an accountant by profession, but I'm working here. And the way we're able to do that is to build those strategic partnerships. Once we have those strategic partnerships, we can grow and build and develop our own ecosystem. I think that's it. That was my last slide. I just want to say from myself, thank you very much for coming today, and I hope you've been excited. Thank you. I hope you've been excited by the opportunities that you will have seen, especially the young children, especially the young girls that have seen an Arab, Saudi, Muslim woman on the International Space Station. And that is something to be genuinely proud of. And when you see that, and when these 2 astronauts come back to Earth, come back to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in my view, that's when the real excitement starts, because that's when we'll engage with the population, the youth, the schools, the academic institutions, and we'll be able to see the outcome of all those scientific experiments that they had undertaken whilst they're up in the International Space Station. So thank you very much.
we go. Good evening, everyone. Let me stand on that side. On this side? Okay. Good evening. My name is Val Munsami. I've joined the Saudi Space Commission in October last year, and I've had over about 25 years of experience in the space sector. And I'm going to build out on the earlier presentations by Frank and Arfan. Frank spoke about the space exploration component, and Arfan kind of touched on the diplomatic aspects of space. I'm going to focus more on the space sciences aspect, the space environment. And by profession, I'm actually a physicist, and I've worked as a space physicist for many years. And then I spent quite a lot of time developing policies and strategies, and also headed up the South African National Space Agency up until February last year. So I'm really excited to be here, and I think the last few days, 2 or 3 days, is actually marking a new turning point in Saudi Arabia in terms of making history with the launch of our astronauts. And so this is marking the beginning of the Saudi space program, which is very big and exciting. And hopefully this year we'll be announcing the strategy, so you'll see the extent of what we have in the pipeline. So I'm going to talk about the sort of the space environment, but just so that you know, the sort of space program sort of started in the 1960s, but actually it existed before that. And if you actually looked at the history of space, it went through 4 distinct phases. It started off with what we call Space 1.0, and that was astronomy. So people looking up and observing the night skies. And that was very important in the sort of 1800s and early 1900s, because when you navigated on the sea, you actually used the stars to navigate, knowing the position of the stars. So when you look at the night sky, the constellations that you observe are fairly fixed. They hardly move. And so that gives you a good guiding point in terms of direction. And so astronomy was quite key from that perspective. But there's more to astronomy than just navigation and guidance. It's also understanding the universe and how we came to be. And I'll talk about that just now. Then we have the second aspect, which is Space 2.0, and that was the Cold War between the US and Russia, or let's say Soviet Union. And the Soviets started off with the launch of the Sputnik. And the US had to actually respond to what the Soviet Union had actually done. And so that was the era of the Cold War. And then Space 3.0 is actually the sort of international collaboration, starting off with the Mir space station, and then leading up to today, which is the International Space Station. And Arfan touched on the different collaborators involved in the International Space Station. So Space 3.0 is about international collaboration. And we're now emerging to Space 4.0, where there's a greater involvement of industry. So when you look at Space 3.0, it was mainly government, space agencies. And now when you get to Space 4.0, you're looking at how industry is coming on board. So we've seen, for example, Frank made the comment around SpaceX launching at least 66% of the payloads last year. Next slide. If you think about this picture, this is kind of the model of the universe in terms of how it began. Now, if you look at the night sky, so the sun is our closest star. But the next closest star is Alpha Centauri. It's about 3 light years away. So let me explain what a light year is. Light has a definite speed. It travels, if you did basic physics, 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, meaning that it travels 300,000 kilometers every second. So if I switch on a light, it will travel 300,000 kilometers in 1 second. That's the speed of light. So the star that you're observing, which is Alpha Centauri, that's the closest star beyond our own sun, the light left that star 2.7 years ago, or three years ago. So when you're observing that star, you're seeing that star 3 years ago. And so as you look further into the universe, you're seeing the universe further back in time. So you're actually traveling back in time. And so if you're standing at one point of the universe, and if you're looking back, you're actually looking back in time. And so we can observe the universe 13.7 billion years ago. So we think that the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years. And if you go right back to when the universe actually started, there's a whole theory as to how the universe was established. And we go back to what is called the Big Bang. Something happened, and it's very difficult to explain it, but we explain it as the Big Bang. Something happened, okay? And so essentially, when you're looking back into time, around 400 million years of that point of the Big Bang is when the first stars emerged. And one of the things is, given the Big Bang, this massive explosion, the whole universe is sort of expanding. It's still expanding. And next slide. So if you look at this as the universe, and you're kind of zooming in, and you're coming into, what you're seeing is a whole massive billions of galaxies as you're zoning in. And as you carry on moving in, you come to a point in the universe right there is a galaxy. This galaxy is called the Milky Way, and that's where we live. And Frank showed you a dot in the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is made up of hundreds of millions of stars, okay? And one of the stars in the Milky Way is our own sun, which is a star. So you will see our star sort of emerging. There it is. And the star actually has a number of planets that's actually rotating around the sun. And as you get closer, you see the 9 planets. And the third planet from the sun itself, right there, is where we live. That's the Earth. Okay? So if you look at the scale of what we are dealing with in terms of the universe, and you start to zoom in, you kind of realize how small we are in the scale of the universe. And what's interesting is, when we look at the night sky, we have a very limited view of what we're actually seeing. Next. Next. Yeah. In fact, we only understand and can observe about 5% of the universe. There's 95% of the universe that we don't understand or we cannot observe. Okay? And so we're building new instruments in terms of how we can view the other 95%, because we're actually limited in terms of the instruments that we have on the ground. And I'll show you a few of those instruments just now. Next. Now, if you looked at the model of the universe as we were zooming in, there's something very peculiar. And we create these concepts to explain things that we don't understand in the universe. And space exploration, like any other exploration domain, is about understanding things that we don't quite know about. And this is one of the areas that we're starting to look into, is astronomy. And we talk about dark matter and dark energy. So what is dark matter? We know that the universe is expanding. If you blow a balloon, you've got to put energy, you've got to blow into it to put energy into the balloon for it to expand. So if the universe is expanding, there must be some energy that's feeding the expansion. And we call that dark energy. Okay? But if you look at our galaxy, the galaxy, Milky Way itself, is not expanding, it's compact. And it's stuck together. That means there's some gravitational effect that's pulling it together. And gravity is formed by matter. And that's why we call it dark matter. The next. The other thing that we're trying to understand is how did the stars actually form? And we'll see our sun just now. The next click. And one of the main theories in terms of trying to understand the universe is Einstein's general theory of general relativity, where he tries to explain gravity using what is called the general theory of relativity. And actually what it says that is if you have a very dense celestial body like the sun or the earth, light is actually bent around because it twists the space and time. And we see that when we're actually observing the solar and the lunar eclipse, we see light is actually bent because of the gravitational effects that Einstein predicted. But as I said, there's 95% of the phenomena in the universe that we don't understand, that we are trying to make sense about. Next slide. So these are kind of instruments, and I picked it up from what I've been working on before. We try to do two things, or many things, but two of the main ways we try to gain observations from the universe. One is we try to listen. So the stars, they're continuously emitting radiation, and some of these are in the radio waves. So we try to pick up sounds that are coming from the universe. And so we try to measure that with these dishes, essentially. And we also try to see the universe using what we call optical instruments. So for example, this is called the Southern African Large Telescope, which is the biggest telescope in the Southern Hemisphere. It's 10-meter diameter mirror. And by the way, this telescope can see, if you're looking with your eye to the moon, it has a resolving power that's 25 million times better than what you can see. So you can see a candlelight at the distance of the moon. The big problem with these dishes is the surface area. You need very big surface areas to be able to observe the universe. And so what you try to do is you have very many antennas and you link them together with fiber networks. And this is actually, you see about several thousands of these dishes, but it's actually one instrument. It's all correlated. And the reason why we do this is we're trying to increase what we call the resolving power of the instrument. Now, you can have a resolving power of many optical telescopes. So, for example, if I'm observing the stars, and if I look up and I see a star, how do I measure the distance to the star? Okay, so I can't do that by looking straight up. So what I do, I stand on one side of the earth, I look up, I see the star. I can measure the angle. I then go to another side of the earth, I stand up and I look at the same star and I measure the angle. I form a triangle essentially. If I know the distance of my two measurement points, I can calculate the distance to the star. So the more points I have on the earth, I can resolve the distance to the star. So this is essentially what these instruments are trying to do, is they're trying to measure the distance of these stars. And that's how we know how far the stars are actually in the galaxy. Next slide. So I want to come into our sun, and I think it's an area that's very little understood. The sun comprises of mainly hydrogen, okay? And what's actually happening deep in the sun, these hydrogen atoms are kind of colliding together, and it's a thermonuclear reaction, meaning that they come together and they fuse. When two hydrogen atoms fuse, they form helium. But when they form helium, they also give off a lot of energy. And this is what you're seeing, this energy that's coming off the sun. And a lot of this that you're seeing coming out of the sun is what we call plasma. So let me explain to you what plasma is. If you take a block of ice, which is solid, you melt it, it becomes liquid. If you heat it up more, you see it starts to bubble, you get water vapor. If you heat the water vapor, you start to strip the electrons and the ions. When you start to separate the electrons and the ions, you create what is called plasma. Okay? And that's essentially what's being spewed out of the sun. Now, on a normal quiet day, the solar plasma is coming out of the sun at a speed of 400 kilometers per second. That's the ambient velocity of the plasma. and it's continuously coming out of the sun. But there are times when the sun gets very active, and I'll talk about that just now. So this is what we call the solar wind, essentially. Next point. So the sun actually goes through like we have seasons on Earth, it goes through seasons. And it has an 11-year cycle. What you see on the far left, that little green bubble, is if you take, so you should not be looking at the sun directly. If you take a magnifying glass and if you shine it on the piece of paper, you will see the reflection of the sun or an image of the sun. But in there you will see little spots. Okay? That's not dirt on your magnifying glass. It's actually sunspots. And when you look at it in the middle, it's actually dark spots. So it's magnetic field lines that are trapping the plasma, making it cooler. And if you count the number of spots, it actually follows an 11-year cycle. Okay? So this is essentially what's creating some of the phenomena that we call space weather. Next slide. Next slide. So what has this to do with the Earth? As I said, the ambient velocity of this plasma that's coming towards us is 400 kilometers per second. But when you have these events, so we call these coronal mass ejections, where the plasma, where there's instability in the sun, and it bursts the plasma outwards. And that plasma can go up to 600 to 1,000 kilometers per second. And that's when you have to be alert on Earth, because lots of things start to happen on the Earth's surface and in the Earth's environment. The only thing that's actually protecting us or shielding us is actually the Earth's magnetic field. If you understand the basic physics, a charged particle does not cross a magnetic field line. If it crosses it, it actually starts to drift away. Okay? And so the Earth's magnetic field is actually deflecting all of these radiation, not completely, but to a large extent. So it's actually protecting us. And by the way, if the Earth did not have a magnetic field, we would not be here. We'll actually be radiated. We won't exist. And that's a big problem if you're going to the moon or you're going to Mars. Moon and Mars don't have a magnetic field. So when you're creating habitats on the moon and Mars, you have to ensure that you create an artificial magnetic field to protect you from radiation. Next slide. So what happens is, so there's a whole domain of physics trying to understand what actually happens in the Earth's environment. This is called magnetospheric physics. But there's two areas that I want to point out that's very important for space exploration. The area that's called the plasmasphere, these two dark little bubbles in there, that's where the radiation gets trapped. So with this excessive radiation that comes in and seeps into the Earth's environment, it gets trapped there. So you might be aware of what's called the Van Allen radiation belts. That's where the radiation gets trapped. The other area is, right on the top, you see the plasma comes into the magnetic field. And Frank showed the aurora. That's what giving rise to the aurora. Those charged particles coming through the magnetic field, they come through the polar regions. And what you're seeing, that green, pinkish hue, the green is when the radiation hits the oxygen atoms. It excites it, but the oxygen atom doesn't want to stay there, it wants to come down. It gives off light and heat, and that light is appearing green. The pinkish light is from the nitrogen excitation. So that's what's giving rise to the aurora effects. So when you see aurora, that means there's something happening. Okay? And by the way, there was a solar event 3 days ago, just before the launch. Yeah, glad to see we're all excited about what's happened. Okay. Next slide. Now, the effects of solar radiation is felt across the world. Okay, so first of all, when you have excessive radiation in the Earth's environment, because this radiation is charged particles, one of the things that happens is if you have a satellite that's switched on, the charged particles can get into the satellite and they discharge and they destroy the electric circuits. And they've actually damaged quite a lot of satellites. There's a whole industry, insurance industry, that's based around predicting solar weather to insure your satellites from damage. The second thing is that the astronauts, they cannot do spacewalks because there's excessive radiation. You will get radiated. So when you have a space weather event, you've got to stay in the shuttle. You don't step out. The other effect is because you have excessive radiation and particles that are in the Earth's environment, the more pressure, the more particles you have, that means the resistance increases. Okay? If the resistance increases, it means it's slowing you down. And if you're slowing down, you're dropping from the Earth's orbit. And that means you can start to deorbit. Other effects, when you have excessive radiation, the signal coming from the satellites get absorbed. It doesn't come through. Like GPS, if there is a solar weather event, you don't see the GPS signal. If you're watching satellite or digital TV, sometimes if there's a storm above you, you don't see the signal because it gets attenuated, because there's too much of charged particles floating in the atmosphere and the ionosphere. One of the things that I should also mention, because we Aramco, pipelines, that's a big problem. If you think about it, you have these current systems in the ionosphere. If you have a current floating, and if you have like a conductor on the ground, Lenz's law, basic school physics, if you have an alternating current in one line, it induces a current in the other line. And what actually happens, it induces the current in the oil pipelines. And the moment you put a current into a metal structure, it accelerates the oxidation, meaning the corrosion. So it starts to rust quicker. So that's a huge problem even for electrical pipelines. We've seen electrical grids collapse where the transformers are saturated in one direction and it blows up the transformer, all because of space weather. The only way you can mitigate against that is to switch off your satellites, switch off these electric components. So there's a whole science around space weather, purely because of what's happening on the sun. And by the way, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, big data. All of those technologies are hit on the ground because of these current systems. So as much as we depend on technology, we're also prone to the space environment. And next slide. So this is a special event where there's a coronal mass ejection. You'll see the date, the 29th of January, 2022. Does anybody know what happened here? Something happened on the space mission. So what you're seeing here, so that's showing you how active the sun. So there's a little blotch of white light that's ringed up. So that's a solar flare. It's spewing out the plasma. It reached out the Earth a few days later. This is a coronagraph. So if you put a satellite between the Earth and the sun, and you look at the sun, and you block out the middle, you're seeing the corona of the sun. So it's a coronagraph. And what it's showing you is the plasma that's been jettisoned out of the sun. By the way, Starlink launched 49 satellites around about that time. It destroyed 40 satellites of the 49. Only 9 survived because of this event. This is in 2022. Okay. And that was because, firstly, discharging radiation, destroying some of the satellites, but also the drag started to drop some of the satellites out of orbit. Okay. So you can see this is very important, and for space situational awareness, you have to have space weather as part of the mitigation plan as well. Next slide. So, why? I know Frank spoke about the space exploration aspect. I want to speak a slightly different angle. Why is space important for us? If you think about it, we use space every day without knowing it. Everybody in the audience has a cell phone. A lot of that technology is dependent on space technology. Okay. So how do we get to space? So this is a simple demonstration of how you put an object into space. So imagine you're standing on one side of the field and you're throwing a ball. So it follows that arc. Then I say to you, throw it further. So you put more energy and you throw it further, and you keep doing that. Okay, so the ball goes further and further. Next slide. So what actually happens if you throw it with enough energy? This is called a Newton gun experiment, by the way, if you're interested. If you throw it with enough energy, because the Earth is spherical and it's curving away, the ball actually is falling towards the Earth, but because the Earth is curving away, it keeps falling into the Earth, but not quite reaching the Earth. Okay? And that's when we put objects into orbit. It's actually falling to Earth. It's not 0G, it's microgravity. You're actually falling. It's not that it's 0G, you're falling all the time. Okay? And it seems like you're floating, but you're actually falling. So there's different types of orbits. There's low Earth orbit, which is around 400 to 600 kilometers, and we use that quite a lot for Earth observation. There's also the medium Earth orbits, which is used for GPS satellites or global navigation satellite services. And then we have geostationary orbits, which is about 36,000 kilometers away. And by the way, if you're watching digital TV or satellite TV, you'll notice that all of your satellite dishes are pointing in the same direction because they're pointing to the same satellite, which is 36,000 kilometers away. And I'll explain to you how that works. Next slide. So we have these thousands of satellites that's providing services to us. And at the moment, there's about 10,000, or just under 10,000 of operational satellites, but there's about 40,000 of them in total, and a lot of them are not functional. Okay, so it's space debris. So that's a big problem because at the moment, there's plans to put tens of thousands of satellites into orbit. And the more debris you have, the chances of collision actually increases. So there's a big move, even in the United Nations, to create guidelines for ensuring the long-term sustainability of space. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so I want to explain to you the core applications that we use the space environment for, especially satellites. So what you're seeing here is sunlight coming down and being reflected off a tree, okay? If you shine a white light on a prism, and if you break it up, it forms the rainbow colors, okay? So the primary colors are red, blue, and green. So what actually is happening at the micro level, at the leaf, it's seeing the three primary colors, but it's absorbing the red and the blue, but it's emitting the green. So that's why the tree, the leaf, looks green, because you're seeing the green, but you're not seeing the blue and the red. So it's selectively absorbing the red and the blue, okay? And that's how we see different colors. Some colors are absorbed and some colors are reflected. So depending what's reflected, that's the color you see. And what's actually happening is the satellite is picking up those reflections from, let's say, the tree samples. Next slide. Not to be scared by this slide, I'll explain to you exactly what it means, okay? So, if you go to a doctor and they do an X-ray, the X-ray has very short wavelengths, meaning it's very high energy. Because it's high energy, short wavelengths, it can go through your skin, but not through the bone, okay? If you're looking at the radio waves, it's long wavelengths, low energy, so it means it can travel over the land. Okay? So you go from short wavelengths to long wavelengths, X-rays, gamma rays to radio waves on the long wavelength. Now, by the way, you and I can only see here. This is called the visible spectrum. This is what we see and observe, this part. Okay? So when you're looking at it from a satellite, you're looking at the reflection from a satellite. The visible part is here. This information, which is in the infrared, you and I cannot see it. But look at the amount of information that you see in the other parts of the spectrum, or you observe in the other parts of the spectrum that you and I cannot see. So in the infrared, for example, in this part, it can tell you what the cell structure is. So different plants would have different signatures. So I can tell you this is maize, I can tell you this is wheat or grass, just by observing the cell structure. As you go further on, this tells you how much of water vapor is in the plant. Okay? We can use this information, for example, if the cell structure changes, it means there might be a disease encroaching. So we can pick up signatures that there's changes happening. The same here, if this changes, that means the water level in the plant is changing. We use this kind of information for what is called precision farming, for agriculture. Okay? If you use the same principle, by the way, so you continuously, because the satellites come by, and Frank was talking about 90 minutes if it's on low Earth orbit, so you're getting systematic coverage. And we put a satellite in sun-synchronous orbit, meaning that if it comes by at 9 o'clock today, tomorrow it'll come back at 9 o'clock, following day at 9 o'clock. So you can stack up the images every single day at exactly the same time. And if you see any changes, you'll know that there's something happening. So for example, if there's a water body, and I'm looking at the same water body at 9 o'clock every day, and one day the signature changes, that means there's something happening. And we see, for example, cholera as an example, which is a waterborne disease, before you see it with your naked eye, because you see it in the infrared. We see pests through this kind of technique before you see it with your naked eye. So this is a very powerful technique. This is called Earth observation remote sensing. And we use it for a whole host of applications. Okay, the next slide. Oh, here's an example of a satellite imagery, which is corrected. And the reddish area is showing a field that is stressed. And actually, if you go to that very same field and you look at it, it is actually stressed. There's a drought condition. Okay? Some of the fields are irrigated, so it appears green, and others are stressed. So from satellite observations, you can immediately tell how much of the plantation is actually well watered and is healthy, and others that are actually stressed. And by the way, a lot of this informs economics as well. For example, if a farmer wanted to know what's my yield, let's say I'm growing maize crop, right? What he does, he squares off a certain area of the farm, and he counts the number of crops. And he knows the full hectarage of his farm, and he can extrapolate. And he can say, this is what my yield looks like. But with satellite technology, using artificial intelligence, you can actually do a much more accurate count. And so that will determine the price of maize on the market just by using some of these applications, artificial intelligence and the likes. There is many, many use cases. It will take a whole day to explain a lot of these use cases. Okay? So that's from the Earth observation point of view. Next slide. Now, I know there's some colleagues from the CITC who are much more experts than myself. So essentially, as I said, these satellites, the telecommunication satellites, are around 36,000 kilometers away. So you can be watching a live sport event that is at one point of the Earth. Let's say you're watching Formula One or football. It's happening at one point of the Earth. That signal is transmitted to the satellite. The satellite then receives it and retransmits it back. So if you have satellite dishes on your roof, you're actually picking that signal from that particular satellite, okay, which is providing you the service. So it is a point transmission to multi-point, point to multi-point transmission, okay? So this is how the geostationary satellites actually work. So you get your satellite TV signals coming through this backbone. And by the way, if you go to a bank in a mall and you do a transaction at an ATM, the likelihood is that that ATM is linked through a telecom satellite. That signal for that transaction to the bank is going through a telecom satellite. The timing stamp for that satellite comes from a GPS for that transaction come from a GPS satellite. So the whole economy is being driven, or let's say most of the economy is being driven by satellite technology. Next slide. So this is trying to explain how GPS actually works, okay? So a lot of us have mobile phones, even in your cars, you have built-in GPSs. So you plug in a destination and it tells you the most optimal route to get there and how long it will take you to get there. So how does GPS satellites or GPS actually works? So in your device or in your car, you have a receiver that can receive satellite signals. So what these GPS satellites are very accurate clocks. They are atomic clocks, essentially. And they're transmitting signals that tells you accurate time. So it can tell you the time it left the satellite and the time at which it reached your phone or your receiver, okay? And if you have 3 satellites, so if you want to measure this point in 3 dimensions, you need to have 3 reference points, your X, Y, and your Z. And likewise, you would need to have 3 signals. So what your receiver is receiving is the time it took to leave that satellite to reach your transmitter, and it does that from 3 different satellites, and then you triangulate, and it tells you more or less where you are on the surface of the Earth. Okay? So your transmitter or your receiver in your phone or in your car is receiving 3 different signals from 3 different satellites, triangulating it and giving you a position. So this is how it's working, essentially. This is in 2 dimensions. If you put another satellite, it tells you the reference points in 3 dimensions. Okay? So this is a GPS signal, and that's also telling you, giving you a time signal and a timestamp for like bank transactions and the like. It's coming from the satellites. Okay. Next slide. One of the problems with the GPS satellites or the GNSS satellites is there's a error in the signal. So sometimes you'll notice you put in a location where you want to drive, and as you're driving, you see that you're not on the road. You're actually driving on the side of the road. And that's because the GPS signal has an error. And so, by the way, this is the red crosses, signals from the GPS satellites. So you can see, I've put what a 1 meter distance looked like. So this can be off by 5 to 10 meters. So sometimes you actually drive on the side of the road because of this error signal. But we can correct for that signal by using what is called satellite-based augmentation system. So it's another satellite that's kind of coming into play where it's correcting the signals for the GPS, and it gives you a much more accurate location. Now, we need very accurate locations to within a meter. There are many countries that have what you call, for example, informal settlements, not houses. They don't have post office addresses. And how do you give them, assign them a post office? You give them a GPS location. But if the error signal is off by more than a meter, you're going to have a problem. If it's off by 10 meters, you could be marking another house. Automated lending, you need very accurate location signals. So if you're off by 10 meters, that could be a problem, especially in the rural landing strips, where the landing strips are very narrow. Safety of life operations. You want to know somebody's lost in the mountains. You want accurate information. This becomes very important. Okay. I think this is my last slide. Next slide. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
أهلا وسهلا، حياكم الله في فعالية السعودية نحو الفضاء. معكم أنا أحمد
وأنا طيف. في تاريخ 21 مايو صار في حدث تاريخي للمملكة العربية السعودية، وهو أول إطلاق مهمة علمية للمملكة إلى محطة الفضاء الدولية،
واللي كان على متنها أول رائدة فضاء سعودية ريانة برناوي، وعلي القرني أيضا، والذي يعد أول رائد فضاء سعودي يصل إلى محطة الفضاء الدولية.
طبعا انطلق صاروخ فالكون 9 في هذه المهمة حاملا معه تطلعات المملكة في مجالات الفضاء والعلوم والتقنية.
طبعا ممكن نتساءل كيف أن الصاروخ يروح للفضاء؟ اللي قاعد يصير داخل حجرة الاحتراق في الصواريخ هو تفاعل كيميائي بين المادة المشعلة والوقود، واللي بنتعرف على كثير من التفاعلات الكيميائية في تجاربنا الحية لهذا اليوم.
طبعا اليوم راح نقدم عدة تجارب علمية، راح نستمتع وبرضو نتعلم منها أشياء جديدة، وراح تشاركونا بتحدياتنا اللي راح نعيشها مع بعض. خلونا نبدأ بأول تجاربنا. مستعدين؟ طيب قبل ما أبدأ بتجربتي الأولى أنا أحتاج شخصين عشان يساعدوني بهذه التجربة.
طيب مين حاب يطلع معانا؟ خلينا نشوفكم.
طيب نختار من هنا.
تطلع؟
طيب
اللي لابس توب. لا اللي لابس توب.
أيوة تعال. أي
أنت تطلع؟
أيوة.
لا بس اللي لابس توب. طيب تعال من هنا. تعال من هنا يا بطل. شو اسمك؟ إبراهيم. شو اسمك؟ ها؟ الفال. طيب عطهم تحية.
طيب تجون معي هنا.
تعالوا معي هنا.
طيب أبي منكم تفتحون عندي هذه علبة الكولا هنا. يلا تعال معاي افتح علبة الكولا. طيب. هذه يلا
تفتحين علبة
حطها هنا.
أيوة.
يلا
أساعدك. يلا.
أيوة
شوي.
برافو عليك.
أريدك شوي.
طيب الحين حنا بنفتح المشروب الغازي. راح أعطي كل واحد قطعة من الحلو ونشوف وش بيصير معانا. يلا.
طيب.
لكن عشان نقدر نحطها مع بعض امسك هذه واحدة خلها معاك. امسكي.
خذي الحلاوة.
يلا تحطونها جميع. يلا 1 2 3. يلا حطوها.
يا سلام عليكم.
طيب ها ايش لحظت معي؟ ايش فيه؟ ايش طلع؟ برافو عليك. قال طلع معنا غازات. ها وش اللي طلع معانا هنا؟ غازات. نعطيهم تحية. تفضلوا معي هنا.
شكرا لك يعطيك العافية.
طيب خلونا شوي نقول ليش طلع معي هنا المشروب الغازي دفعة واحدة. أنا عطيتهم قطعة حلوى. قطعة الحلوى هذه تحتوي على كمية كبيرة من السكر، بالتالي لما حطيناها على المشروب الغازي خلت المشروب الغازي اللي هو فيه غاز ثاني أكسيد الكربون يطلع دفعة واحدة. طيب وش رايكم نسوي هذه التجربة بشكل أكبر؟ ها تبون نسوي بشكل أكبر؟ طيب يلا الحين أحتاج ناس كبيرة شوي معاي. ها مين
طيب
بيطلع معايا؟
طيب من هنا شاف
اللي لابس أزرق. أي تعال.
طيب لا بس اللي لابس أزرق. لا ورا.
لا اللي لابس أزرق. أيوة تعال. كبير
بس.
معليش.
أيوة طيب نختار اللي ورا اللي تأشر. من هنا. طيب شو اسمك؟ يحيى. طيب نحتري.
بسم الله. تفضل
تعال معي هنا. لا خلاص. ها تعالوا من هنا. طيب شو اسمك؟ هاي طيب اعطهم تحية.
تفضلي معي هنا.
تعال.
طيب أنا راح أستخدم مواد كيميائية، عشان كذا أنا أحتاج أدوات سلامة. ها وش عندنا أدوات سلامة؟ أيوة النظارات. طيب البسوا جلافز وأنا راح ألبس معاكم برضو. طيب الحين قاعدين نلبس أدوات سلامة. بعد كذا أنا راح أستخدم أول مادة كيميائية معاي اللي هي اسمها ماء الأكسجين. طبعا أحتاج فقط 250 ملي من ماء الأكسجين. طبعا راح أحط لي هنا فقط 250 ملي. طيب خلوني أشرح إيش هذه المادة اللي أنا حطيتها هنا. ماء الأكسجين عبارة عن ماء مشبع بغاز الأكسجين بشكل جدا كبير. طيب البسي النظارات. يلا ها، راح أحط لزميلنا هنا برضو. طيب الحين أبي منك تاخذين الدورق هذا وتحطينه هنا. يلا يلا خلينا نحطه مع بعض هنا.
مويه داخل الدورق. السلام عليكم.
بعدها راح أحط مادة كلنا تقريبا نعرفها. ها ايش رايكم؟ وشو هذه؟ ايوه الصابون. طيب راح احط كمية بسيطة من الصابون على الدورق. طبعا انا ليش حطيت كمية بسيطة من الصابون؟ عشان اقدر اشوف التفاعل بشكل واضح. ايوه برافو عليك. طيب انتم تقريبا بقالنا عندنا مادتين. المادة هذه اللي راح اخذها ابيكم انتم تحددون لي ايش اختار من هذه الالوان. يلا ايش رايكم؟ احط اخضر، احمر ولا اصفر؟ طيب انا راح احط اصفر. ها ايش تختارين معانا؟ اخضر ولا احمر؟ اخضر. طيب يلا صديقنا، يلا خلينا نحط شوي من الالوان على الدورق. طيب انا راح امزجوا معاي. راح امزج المواد اللي انا حطيتها هنا. طيب قولوا لي تشوفون تفاعل؟ لا، بالاصل ترى يوجد تفاعل لكنه جدا جدا بطيء. عشان كذا عندنا المادة الأخيرة اللي هي مادة يوديد البوتاسيوم اللي هي بمثابة المحفز عندنا. طيب راح نبعد الأدوات شوي. راح أعطيكم المادة الأخيرة. نحط هذا هنا. طيب تفضل، لا معاك وأنتي برضو خليها معاك. طيب أول من نحط هذه المادة، ركزوا معاي، راح نحطها وناخذ خطوة للخلف. تمام؟ يلا تعدون معنا. يلا 1 2 3. يلا طيب نعطيهم تحية.
يعطيك العافية، سعد النظرات.
يعافيك. طيب خلونا شوي نشوف مع بعض وش تشوفون اللي فوق هذا. ها اللي فوق الرغوة ايش؟ بخار. برافو عليكم. هذه يدل اللي صار معي التفاعل صار فيه حرارة. طبعا صار عندي هنا تحولات طاقة، تحولت عندي الطاقة الكيميائية إلى طاقة حرارية، وبكذا انتهينا من تجربتنا الأولى.
نبدأ تجربتنا الثانية. خلوني أسألكم سؤال. كيف نقدر نروح للفضاء؟ عن طريق إيش؟ يا سلام عليكم، عن طريق الصاروخ. وطبعا الصاروخ فيه نوعين من الوقود، اللي هو الوقود السائل والوقود الصلب. أنا عندي اليوم هذه التجربة مادة مشابهة لوقود الصواريخ السائل اللي هي الأسيتون، ونبي نشوف مع بعض إذا أضفنا هذه المادة داخل هذا الدورق وش التفاعل اللي بيكون معي. طبعا التفاعل بيكون سريع جدا، فأبغاكم تلاحظون اللهب اللي خارج من هذا الدورق. خلونا نشوف مع بعض. طيب كنترول نطفي بس النور. ركزوا معاي. تفاعل ترى بيكون سريع جدا. تعدون معي؟ 1 2. لاحظتوا اللهب البسيط هذا يدل على انه كان عندي كمية من الدفع. خلونا نجرب لكن بدورق آخر. خلونا نشوف. عندي هنا نضيف نفس الشيء مادة الأسيتون ونشوف مع بعض. طيب يلا تعدون معي. يلا 1 2. لاحظنا هذا الصوت والنار اللي نشوفه مع بعض طالعين هنا. طيب ايش رايكم نلاحظ كمية الدفع اللي تخرج هذه المادة؟ لكن ابغى شخص يشارك معي. نبي نختار شخص واحد. مين؟ لا انا بختار من ورا المرة هذه. مين؟ اللي لابس ابيض هناك. ايه اللي لابس ابيض ورا. تعال معي هنا بسرعة. تعال من هنا. بسرعة ولا طلع واحد ثاني. يا سلام عليك. لا 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 خلاص بس واحد.
طيب وش اسمك؟ ميار. ها وش اسمك؟ ايه؟
طيب تعالوا كلكم عندي هنا.
يلا اعطوهم تحية. يلا رحنا.
طيب ميار تجين عندي هنا. مستعد؟ شو اسمك؟ عبد الرحمن. طيب ميار تعالي معي هنا. ابغاك تضيفين انت هذه المادة، يعني كأنك انت الحين تبي تحطين هذه المادة داخل الدورة، زين؟ او داخل هذه القارورة. عبد الرحمن هو اللي بيطلقه. اتفقنا؟ طيب امسكي. حطي هنا كمية بسيطة. ايوه. يا سلام عليك. يلا باقي الحين دور عبد الرحمن. مستعد عبد الرحمن؟ تجين عندي ميار هنا. انت وعبد الرحمن تعالوا كلكم هنا. يا سلام عليك. طيب ابغاكم تعدون مع عبد الرحمن. تعالوا معي هنا شوي عشان ما يصلى. يا سلام عليك. تعال عبد الرحمن قدام. امسك هذه الولاعة. طيب ابغاك تولع الفتحة اللي موجودة في الغطاء، زين؟ ايوه لا لا كذا. تعال عندي هنا شوي. يا سلام عليك. طيب ابغاكم تعدون مع عبد الرحمن. امسك الولاعة، زين؟ يلا. لا 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 خل الولاعة. ايوه كذا ابعد. يلا انا وياك. يلا 1 2. طيب اعطوهم تحية. شكرا لكم ميار وعبد الرحمن. طيب يعني لاحظنا من هذا التفاعل كمية الدفع اللي خارجة من هذه المادة. طبعا الصواريخ عشان تروح للفضاء تحتاج كمية كبيرة جدا عشان تقدر تتعدى جاذبية الأرض وتصل للفضاء. وبكذا نكون انتهينا من تجربتنا الثانية. طيب ما تحمستوا تعرفون وش اللي مغطى عندي هنا؟ طيب وش اللي موجود تتوقعون؟ صاروخ؟ طيب خلونا نشوف مع بعض. هذه التجربة أو هذا المدفع اسمه مدفع الهواء أو الإير زوكا. طبعا هذه التجربة ترى أي أحد يقدر يسويها لأن أدواتها بسيطة جدا. موجود عندي هذا المدفع. سوينا هنا فتحة من المنتصف ووضعنا قطعة من القماش في الخلف عشان نساعد على خروج الهواء من هذا المدفع لاتجاهكم. لكن قبل لا نشوف هذه التجربة خلوني أسألكم سؤال. هل الهواء احنا نقدر نحس فيه ولا نشوفه؟ يعني ما في أحد يقدر يلاحظ حركة الهواء اللي موجودة هنا عندنا، صح؟ طيب خلونا نشوف مع بعض. أنا بمسك هذا الغطاء ونبي نشوف مع بعض. مستعدين؟ طيب نبي نشوف هل الهواء نبي نلاحظه من هذا المدفع أو نبي نشوف أن القطع اللي موجودة عندي هنا تبي تتحرك فقط. طيب خلونا نشوف مع بعض. لاحظتوا هواء خارج من البرميل أو هذا المدفع؟ اللي لاحظنا أن هذه القطعة تتحرك. طيب وش رأيكم الحين نخلي هذه التجربة أفضل؟ واللي بنسويه أننا نضيف كمية من جهاز الدخان ونبي نشوف مع بعض حركة الهواء وهي خارجة من هذا المدفع لاتجاهكم. خلونا بس نعدل المدفع ونشوف مع بعض. طيب خلونا نشوف مع بعض. يعني لاحظنا الآن حركة الهواء وهي خارجة من هذا المدفع. يعني إن الهواء حنا نقدر نلاحظ حركته لكن إذا اختلطت فيه ذرات معينة. طيب الحين أبغى أسوي تحدي على نفس هذه التجربة وأبغى 4 أشخاص بس. اللي يقوم من كرسيه ترى أنا ماني مختاره. يلا من الحين كل واحد يقدر كرسيه. طيب بختار من هنا شخصين. مين يطلع معانا؟ ترى اللي قايم ماني مختاره. أيوة نقعد كلنا نختار مين؟
طيب نختار من هنا الجهة هذه؟
لا الكبار نبيهم بعد شوي. الحين نبغى ناس صغار. طيب تعال معي أنت هنا.
يلا لابسة
لا
خضراء. أيوة تعالي.
لا الثاني. أيوة طيب نبغى شخص ثاني. مين؟
الولد اللي ورا.
طيب هذا يطلع.
أيوة
يلا تعال.
طيب تعالوا معي هنا.
طيب.
شو اسمك يا بطل؟
باقي لنا شخص.
يزيد. واللي معنا هنا تعال يزيد هنا.
شو اسمك؟ هيف. شو اسمك؟ جنان. يلا باقي زميلنا.
تعالوا هنا معي تفضلوا.
شو اسمك؟ علي. طيب عطوهم تحية.
طيب خلونا نشرح التحدي الآن. راح نكون فريقين هنا وبنشوف مين الفريق اللي يقدر يدخل أكبر عدد حلقات معي بالحلقة الكبيرة اللي معاي. ها خلينا نشوف الفريق الأول بيفوز
ولا لا؟ مين يقول إن الفريق الأول بيفوز؟
الفريق الأول أهلا. تعال
عندي هنا، تعال عندي هنا عشان
طيب
نجرب مع بعض.
الفريق الثاني
هنا
يلا. لا أجين بنشوف الفريق الأول ممكن يفوز. الفريق الثاني طيب امسك الحلقة.
طيب اللي بيصير الحين أنا عندي نفس هذا المدفع لكنه بالشكل الصغير، ونبي نعبي فيه دخان ونبي نشوف هل يقدرون يدخلون كامل حلقات الدخان في الحلقة البلاستيكية أو لا. مستعد علي؟
يلا.
طيب خلينا نشوف مع بعض. تعال عندي هنا عشان نجرب بعد شوي. يا سلام عليك، خليك واقف هنا.
بس.
طيب
ايوه ارفعها فوق.
تعال اوقف هنا، امسك المدفع بيدك اليمين او اللي يا سلام عليك. اسحب هذه القطعة وفكها. اسحب فك. يا سلام عليك. يلا 1 لك 3 محاولات. بساعدك. 2 يا سلام، باقي لك 3. طيب عطوه تحية. نبي نشوف الفريق الثاني.
يلا تروحين معه هناك. يلا روح هناك عندي.
يلا نشوف الحين.
يلا ارفع الحلقة فوق.
مستعدة تتوقعين تفوزين عليهم ولا لا؟ طيب خلينا نشوف مع بعض. طيب امسكي ايدك. يا سلام عليك. جيبي ايدك الثانية، اسحبي هذه القطعة بعدين فكيها، اسحبيها زيادة. يلا فكيها. يلا 1 يلا 2 يا سلام 3. عطوه تحية.
برافو. تفضلوا معي هنا.
طيب
كل الفريقين
شكرا لكم، يعطيكم العافية. شو اسمك يا بطل؟ عطوه تحية، أقوى تحية. شكرا. يلا طيب يعني لاحظنا من هذه التجربة أننا نقدر نلاحظ الهواء، لكن إذا اختلطت فيه ذرات معينة أيا كانت ذرات الدخان اللي موجود عندي هنا، أو ممكن نقدر نلاحظ حركة الهواء في الجو الخارجي إذا اختلطت فيه ذرات التراب اللي هو الغبار. إذا صار عندنا غبار احنا نقدر نلاحظ حركة الهواء. بكذا نكون انتهينا من هذه التجربة.
طيب أكيد عندنا ببيوتنا في أدوات ومواد نقدر نسوي منها تجارب مرة كثير، اللي ممكن نستخدمها بالزراعة أو بالتنظيف أو حتى ممكن بالطبخ. طيب أنا معي هنا ذر النشا، راح أسوي فيه تجربة، لكن خلوني أسألكم سؤال. هل ذر النشا آمن ولا خطير؟ طيب أنا أسمع إجابات مختلفة، أحد يقول آمن، في أحد يقول خطير. طيب لو نعرض للحرارة تتوقعون بيصير آمن ولا خطير؟ طيب خلونا نشوف بهذه التجربة الآن. خلينا نشوف لو عرضنا النشا الحرارة إيش بيكون معانا. يلا تعدون معنا. 1. طيب خلونا نشوفها مرة ثانية. طبعا أنا سويت أنبوب وحطيت فيه كمية بسيطة من النشا، راح نعرضه للحرارة.
يلا تعدون معنا مرة ثانية. 1.
طيب مثل ما لاحظتوا معي هنا أنا قدرت أشغل النشا. طيب خلونا نعرف إيش السبب. طبعا لما نفخ صديقنا أحمد على المنفاخ ووزع النشا بشكل كبير على السطح، بالتالي تداخلت ذرات الأكسجين بشكل أكبر، عشان كذا حنا قدرنا نشغل النشا. وبكذا انتهينا من تجربتنا الثالثة. طيب خلونا شوي نتعرف على اختلاف الضغط الجوي. طيب الحين مثلا لو رحنا لأماكن مرتفعة أو سافرنا بالطيارة، وش تلاحظون بذانكم؟ أيوة لاحظتوا في ضغط بذانكم. طيب إيش السبب هذا الضغط؟ اليوم إن شاء الله بشوفها بشكل أكبر. طيب أنا عندي هنا وعاء بالأسفل فيه موية باردة، تمام؟ صح؟ موية باردة جدا، وحطينا زيادة فيه ثلج، وعندنا هذا البرميل الموية فيه جدا جدا ساخنة، وصلنا الموية جوا البرميل لدرجة حرارة غليان جدا مرتفعة. أنا معي هذا اللي راح أزود من برودة هذا البرميل، بنشوف معانا إيش ممكن يصير. وش تلاحظون على البرميل؟ دخان صح؟ طيب إيش ممكن يحصل؟ توقعوا معي يلا.
ينفجر؟
طيب ايش لاحظتوا معي ايش صار هنا؟ برافو عليك، ما انا سمعت اجابه صحيحه هنا. هو ما انفجر، هو صار عكس الانفجار تماما، انكمش البرميل. ايش سبب انكماش البرميل هنا عندي؟ بالبرميل جوا صار في عمليه، تحول بخار المويه الى سائل مره ثانيه وصار في عمليه تكثف، عشان كذا صار الضغط جوا البرميل جدا ضعيف والضغط خارج البرميل جدا قوي، بالتالي ايش صار فيه؟ صار فيه انكماش. وبكذا انتهينا من تجربتنا الرابعه.
طيب تجربتنا الأخيرة بنتعرف فيها على تحولات الطاقة، واللي بتحول عندي الطاقة الكيميائية إلى طاقة حرارية وطاقة قليلة من الطاقة الضوئية، وهذا يسمى الديناميكا الحرارية. وخلونا نشوف مع بعض، لكن أبغى شخصين كبار شوي يجربون معنا هذه التجربة.
إذا في آباء ولا أمهات يبون يشاركون معانا،
نبغى ناس كبار.
في؟ تبون نسويها حنا؟
طيب مين اللي ورا؟ قبل شوي رفع يده وقلنا له بعد شوي. أنت واللي ورا اللي يأشر كذا. يلا مين بيطلع منكم؟ ولا نختار من الجهة هذه؟
طيب ممكن.
إيه تعالوا هناك واحد. طيب اخترنا شخص، نبي شخص ثاني. مين حاب يطلع هنا؟
هذا.
طيب تعال.
لابس ثوب. لا لابس ثوب اللي.
إيه اللي لابس ثوب.
اللي جنب
لا بس دقيقة الحين طلعوا. لا اللي ورا. أيوة. تعال من هنا. طيب أنا عندي هذه البالونتين. البالون اللي موجودة معي هنا فيها نوعين من الغاز، اللي هو غاز الهيدروجين وغاز الأكسجين، والبالون اللي موجودة هنا فيها غاز واحد واللي هو غاز الهيدروجين. نبي نشوف مع بعض وش الفرق بين هذه البالونتين.
طيب.
وش اسمك؟ شهد. وش اسمك؟ خالد. طيب أعطوهم تحية. طيب لكن قبل نبغى اللي هي السماعات عشان إجراءات السلامة. طيب أبغاكم تلبسون، بس تجين عندي هنا.
تعال هنا معي.
خالد هنا
عشان كلام.
طيب تلبس السماعات. طيب خلونا نبدأ بالبالونة الأولى اللي فيها غاز واحد واللي هو غاز الهيدروجين. نبي نشوف مع بعض وش التفاعل اللي بيصير معنا. مستعد خالد؟ طيب أبغاكم تعدون معه. يلا مد يدك كامل. طيب خلونا نشوف البالونة الثانية، وابغاكم تلاحظون معاي وش الفرق. لكن ترى ممكن الصوت يكون عالي، فأنا أبغى نسكر أذاننا. زين؟ مستعدين؟ طيب أبغاكم تعدون معنا. شهد ما تصير خايفة. يلا طيب أبغاكم تعدون معاها، لكن أبغاك تمسكي من آخر العصا. يا سلام. يلا 1 2 3. طيب أعطوهم تحية.
شكرا.
يعطيكم العافية. طيب لاحظنا من هذه التجربة أنه أيهم أقوى صوت؟ البالونة الأولى ولا الثانية؟ يا سلام عليكم. البالونة الثانية. خلونا نتكلم على شيء اسمه مثلث الحريق. مثلث الحريق هو عبارة أو فيه 3 عناصر. إذا اكتملت هذه ال3 عناصر يكون عندي الحريق. العنصر الأول اللي هو المادة القابلة للاشتعال، والمادة القابلة للاشتعال عندي بهذه التجربة اللي هو الغاز الهيدروجين. نجي لما العنصر الثاني اللي هو الطاقة، والطاقة اللي موجودة معاي اللي هي الطاقة الحرارية الخارجة من الولاعة اللي شفناها قبل شوي. يبقى لنا العنصر الثالث واللي هو مهم جدا في عملية الاحتراق، وما يمكن يكون احتراق إلا بوجود هذا العنصر اللي هو غاز الأكسجين. مجرد ما اكتملت هذه 3 عناصر في البالونة الثانية كان صوتها أعلى وصار عندنا هذا الاحتراق. وبكذا انتهينا من تجاربنا.
لكن حابين ننبه على شيء جدا مهم، انه جميع التجارب اللي تشوفونها هنا خطيرة، عشان كذا ممنوع ان نسويها بالبيت. يعطيكم الف عافية، نشوفكم تجارب ثانية.